Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video on how to avoid falling victim of escalation of commitment. We've seen, on top of a beautiful Harvard Business Review research, that escalation of commitment is among the main reasons, if not the main reason, for which very successful company at a certain point in time, they just stop winning, they get too attached to a failing strategy, they keep on investing on it, until it's too late to recognize that they are actually failing and then they disappear. At the end of the past video, we've seen that not everything needs to be so tragic or dramatic. We've seen that the same decades of study actually gave us 6 golden rules, principles, or processes that each and every single company could apply in order to avoid falling victim of escalation of commitment. So principle number 1, set decision rules. One way to enable a more objective decision-making process is to agree to decision-making rules in advance. Let's consider the case of Intel. When it was about the time to let go of the main technology at that time, DRAM, and to start investing in microprocessor, which would eventually be the future, obviously the company was undecided because DRAM was what made back then Intel. So instead of arguing over religion, they set a very objective formula that was based on a series of criteria, and among them, the most important of them all was margin per wafer. So when it was about the time to decide which technology bring further, that criterion, the margin per wafer, was the real difference maker. That objective decision-making formula was clearly indicating that microprocessor would have been the future, and luckily for Intel, they decided to go with it. So you can argue, yes, but in that case, margin per wafer is a very, numeric figure, is a hard figure. And not every time decision making is based on hard figures. Sometimes it's just not available. Well, luckily the same principle applies to non-numerical rules. That's the case of the famous TV production company that instead of leaving the decision to a very small number of executives centrally, decided to rely on the collective knowledge of the company by creating prototypes to show, sending them to the different local region, and evaluate the number of subscription per prototype. It's only when a prototype of a show would have eventually reached a number of subscription that TV production company would have gave the project a go. Rule number 2, pay attention to voting rules. This is extremely interesting. Let's consider a scenario. 3 top managers, they need to decide whether to continue investing on an existing technology or to embrace a new one. They decide that there are 2 decision-making criteria. The first criterion is the existing technology going to require a substantial amount of investment? And the second, is the new technology going to develop substantially over time? And the decision to shift from a technology to the other was to be taken only if both the criteria were met. Now let's consider the vote. A first member thinks that both of the criteria are met. The second one thinks that only the first one is met and the second is not. And the third one thinks that only the second one is met and the first is not. Now it's really down on how we tally the votes. Typically, Harvard studies underline that the vast majority of companies tend to count the vote in a conjunctive way, meaning considering the opinion of the members of the team. And in this case, it's obviously a no-go because the criteria are not met for the 3 executives. But if we, instead of judging by team member, we judge by criterion, we will see a completely opposite result. In fact, if we count number of positive votes and number of negative votes per single criteria, we will see that both of them, they have 2 positive votes and only 1 negative. So there's a decision of shifting from the old technology to the new technology. So realizing that the vast majority of companies tend to consider the opinion of the team member rather than the objective criteria is already eye-opening. And what Harvard is suggesting is when a company is evaluating whether to switch to an alternative strategy, a disjunctive procedure will be better reflecting of any growing unease with the current course of action. So in other words, you really want to judge and take decision in the most objective way possible. Rule number 3, protect dissenters. We've seen that when a company tends to double down on a failing strategy, it's not unlikely for it to have a number of dissenters. The problem with dissenters is that they tend to think to be alone and they don't want to be shut down. But shutting down the center means taking away one of the fundamental dimensions of innovation, which is with the ability of approaching a problem or an opportunity with a different mindset. It means to basically kill radical collaboration, which we saw being one of the first and biggest motor towards innovation. So there are certain practices that you can follow in order to protect the centers. First of all, deploy larger teams. Harvard studies show us that CEOs tend to rely on small team of trusted executives, typically 3 or 4. And when there's a single dissenter, it tends to be shut down, even if 1 out of 4, it's 25% of the voting power. The good news is that the same research show us that in a team of around 12 people, it takes only 2 people to dissent in order for the opinion or the alternative to be considered, even if that represents less than 17% of the voting power. So what Harvard is clearly suggesting after decades of study is not to rely on a team of 3 or 4 or 5 people when it's about strategic decision of the company, but to rely on a team as big as 14 executives, because 14 executives will have a much larger ability of bringing different perspectives and of igniting more constructive dialogues in terms of alternatives. Another way of calibrating diversity would be creating subgroups. Let's consider this example. A group of 4 people which are completely unique in genre, completely unique in background, and completely unique as far as the department in which they work. But this doesn't really result into diversity because people, they don't recognize one another, they don't relate one another, and if they dissent, it's very hard for them to find a common ground. In the second dimension, we have 2 distinct subgroups. So subgroups tend to back up one another and to talk more constructively about alternatives. Another way to protect the center is modeling it out. Let's consider an example, a very beautiful example of a very famous and large European airlines. When it was about the time to decide to invest on a new technology, the CEO in the final meeting sat down and said, okay, we're gonna go with this strategy because we all agreed, but I have second thoughts and I have this kind of doubts. And it was only by then that a second executive stood up and said, yeah, actually I have the same amount of doubts, and he started talking them through in depth, and then the third executive jumped in and agreed, and the fourth, which was the last one, agreed. And in the end, the company stayed with the existing division, which is still, up to now, the most important in the airline. Rule number 4, consider alternatives. Let's consider this very revealing example for Harvard. 2 groups of people were given money. The first group of people was given the alternative to buy a video with that money or not buy the video with that money. As a result, 75% of people bought that video and 25% didn't. The second group of people was given an alternative: buy the video or keep the money for something else. The amount of people that were buying that video in the end dropped to 55%. That shows clearly that when an alternative shows up, our process of reasoning changes deeply. And there's an incredible study of Harvard over 137 major North American companies when they had to decide of an important strategic decision considering only one course of action or one course of action plus an alternative. In the first case, 52% of the decision taken result in a failure. In the second subgroup, in which the company is actually considered an alternative and not only a single course of action, the failure rate dropped to 32%. And I'm sorry, if this is not eye-opening for you, nothing will be. Rule number 5, separate advocacy and decision making. Managers who initiate a course of action are more likely to continue finding it, even in the face of failure, than manager who assume leadership after a project is started. And I know that a lot of you watching this video, if you happen to be executive, you'll think that this doesn't apply to you. But trust me, it probably does. But you can reduce the likelihood of escalation if you give responsibility for a strategic move to people who did not advocate or initiate that move in the first place. Last rule, reinforce the anticipation of regret. A good way to prevent doubling down on a falling strategy is to get managers to anticipate the regret that they might feel not having taken a different road. And you can do that in two different ways. By taking a temporal perspective, so imagine 2 years, 5 years, 1 year down the line, what could go wrong with it. And the second one is to take an interpersonal perspective. We already talked about Intel when it was about the time to decide to let go DRAM to start investing in microprocessor. And the CEO was against that move until famously its co-founder said, okay, imagine that you're removed as a CEO and a new CEO comes in. What would he do? The conclusion is, by its nature, escalation of commitment is very difficult to detect and is absolutely lethal. And obviously, if it's just the three of you talking in the cabinet, it's very likely for you to reinforce the status quo. If it's 14 different people with subgroups with different perspective, you are more likely to approach it with different perspective and considering more alternatives. If you're stuck with only one alternative, there's very little chance that you're gonna get it right in the first place. But if the number of alternatives grows and if the number of objective observation grows with it, well, your company will have a much higher chance of succeeding and keep on dominating the market. Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to subscribe to my page and like my Facebook page, and I'll see you in the next video with some more innovation made simple and strategic use case. Until then, ciao everyone and rock on.